Golden Retriever saves 3 dying tiger cubs. What happens 2 years later is incredible. The wind howled against the windows of John Harrison's cabin, rattling the panes like an impatient visitor demanding to be let in. The morning was dark, the storm clouds thick and oppressive, casting an eerie gloom over the dense forest that surrounded his home. Rain pelted against the roof in heavy sheets, a relentless drumbeat that matched the pounding of John's heart as his phone rang, shattering the early morning silence. He sat up abruptly, the sudden motion causing Bella, his golden retriever, to stir at the foot of the bed. She lifted her head, ears pricking forward, sensing her owner's urgency as he grabbed the phone from the bedside table. "Harrison," he answered, his voice gruff from sleep. "John, it's Wilson Wildlife Reserve. We need you here now." The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Sarah Whitman, the head veterinarian at the reserve. Even through the crackling static, John could hear the tension in her voice. "We found them this morning, 3 tiger cubs. Their mother is gone." John swung his legs over the bed, already pulling on his boots. "Gone? You mean dead?" There was a pause. "We don't know. No body, no signs of struggle. Just gone. And the cubs, John, they're newborns. If we don't act fast, they won't make it." Bella hopped off the bed, tail wagging as she followed John through the small cabin. She had been with him for 7 years, through every rescue mission, every heartbreak, and every moment of triumph. She knew the tone in his voice, the urgency in his movements. Something was wrong. "I'm on my way," John said, grabbing his raincoat. The drive to Wilson Wildlife Reserve was treacherous in the storm. The dirt roads had turned to thick mud, and the trees lining the path swayed violently in the wind. John gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white, his mind racing. A mother tiger disappearing without a trace was unusual. Tigers were fiercely protective of their young. They didn't just abandon them. When he finally pulled up to the reserve, the rain had slowed, but the sky remained a brooding gray. The moment he stepped out of his truck, Sarah was there, her face tight with worry. "Come on," she said, leading him inside. The medical bay was warm compared to the storm outside, the scent of antiseptic and damp fur filling the air. In the center of the room, nestled together in a heated enclosure, were 3 tiny, fragile cubs. Their fur was damp, their stripes faint against their soft bodies, and their eyes were barely open. They whimpered softly, their tiny paws twitching as they huddled together for warmth. "They're dehydrated and weak," Sarah said, running a gentle hand over one of the cubs' backs. "We've started them on formula, but it's not enough. They need constant warmth, contact, something more than just survival." John had seen orphaned animals before. Some took to human care easily, others faded away, their instinctual need for a mother overpowering even the best human intervention. His gaze drifted to Bella, who was watching the cubs with quiet intensity. Her ears twitched as they whimpered again. Then, before John could stop her, she stepped forward, lowering her head into the enclosure. "Bella," John warned, but Sarah held up a hand. "Wait." Bella sniffed the tiny cubs, her wet nose brushing against their fur. One of them, the smallest, let out a tiny, broken sound, a cry barely louder than the whisper of wind against the windows. Without hesitation, Bella began licking him, her tongue moving in slow, rhythmic strokes. The cub stilled, then let out a small, contented sigh. The other 2 pressed closer, their bodies instinctively drawn to her warmth. Sarah sucked in a breath. "John!" But he was already kneeling beside Bella, watching in awe. He had seen her with puppies before, with abandoned fawns and frightened kits. But this was different. Tigers were predators, wild animals. And yet, Bella treated them no differently than she would her own young. "She wants to care for them," Sarah said softly. John nodded, his throat tight. "Then let's see if she can." 12:17. The hours that followed were unlike anything John had ever experienced. The cubs responded to Bella in a way they hadn't to any human intervention. She curled around them, warming them with her body, cleaning their fur with careful, deliberate licks. When they whimpered, she nuzzled them closer. Slowly, they began to settle. "We'll still need to bottle feed them," Sarah said, watching in wonder as Bella rested her head protectively over the cubs. "But this could be what saves them." John had always believed in the power of animals, their ability to heal, to connect in ways humans couldn't always understand. But watching Bella, a domestic golden retriever, take in 3 orphan tiger cubs as if they were her own, this was something else entirely. It defied logic. It defied nature. And yet, it was happening right before his eyes. As the storm outside began to ease, John knew that the Rail challenge was only beginning. Raising orphan tigers was no small feat. There would be obstacles, hard decisions, and unforeseen dangers. But as he watched Bella gently nose the cubs closer to her warmth, he also knew one thing for certain. They had a chance. And sometimes, a chance was all it took. The days that followed were a delicate balancing act, between science and instinct, between human intervention and the unspoken wisdom of nature. Bella had taken to the cubs as though they were her own, curling around their tiny bodies and grooming them with a gentleness that defied every expectation. At first, John and the other staff at Wilson Wildlife Reserve watched with cautious hope, unsure whether the relationship would last, or if Bella's canine instincts would falter against the unfamiliar role of raising tiger cubs. But as the cubs grew stronger, as their once weak cries turned into small, demanding roars, it became clear. Bella had become more than a temporary guardian. She was their mother. Shadow, Storm, and Star, as they had been named, responded to Bella as any young animals would to their maternal figure. When she left the enclosure, even for a few minutes, they whimpered and shuffled closer together, their small ears twitching anxiously until she returned. They climbed over her back with clumsy paws, nipping at her ears the way tiger cubs would with their own kind. But instead of growling or snapping at them, Bella merely huffed and nuzzled them closer, enduring their antics with endless patience. When the staff bottle-fed them, Bella stood close, watching with protective intensity, licking away the stray droplets of formula from their tiny chins, reinforcing the bond that tethered them to her in a way no human could. John spent hours observing them, documenting the unprecedented dynamic that was unfolding before his eyes. He had seen animals form cross-species bonds before, rescued deer that nestled beside abandoned lambs, motherless fox kits raised alongside domesticated cats. But this was something else entirely. Tigers were apex predators, their instincts hardwired for survival. And yet, these cubs were growing under the nurturing presence of a golden retriever, learning behaviors that had never been recorded in the wild. It raised questions. What would they be like when they grew older? Would they retain Bella's gentle influence, or would the call of the wild eventually overtake the lessons they were learning now? The reserve staff debated endlessly about the best course of action. Some argued that the cubs needed to be introduced to their own kind as soon as possible, that prolonged exposure to Bella could cause them to develop unnatural habits. Others, including J.N., believed the bond was too valuable to sever prematurely. The cubs needed time. They needed to be strong enough, confident enough, before they were placed in a setting where their survival instincts would need to take over. As the weeks passed, Bella continued to shape their world in ways no human intervention could. She taught them how to play, her tail wagging as she engaged them in gentle wrestling matches, always letting them win. She disciplined them when they bit too hard, emitting a short, firm bark that startled them into obedience. She comforted them when they cried, her warm body a constant presence that told them they were safe. And yet, despite all the ways she had molded them, the cubs remained unmistakably tigers. Their claws extended instinctively when they pounced. Their small roars grew louder as their confidence built, and their playful swipes carried the promise of the strength they would one day wield. It became evident that the next step was unavoidable. The reserve needed to integrate them into an environment where they could observe and interact with adult tigers. It was a necessary shift, one that had to be made carefully, delicately, to ensure the cubs retained their natural instincts while preserving the bond they had formed with Bella. JN and Sarah worked tirelessly to create a transitional space, a specialized enclosure that allowed the cubs to remain with Bella while also introducing them to the sights, sounds, and smells of their own kind. Maya, an elder tigress who had lived at the reserve for over a decade, became the key to their plan. Unlike the other tigers, who remained wary of humans and uninterested in the presence of other species, Maya had a quiet curiosity about the world beyond her own. She watched the cubs from a distance, her amber eyes calculating, her massive body moving with slow, deliberate grace as she observed them through the barriers that separated her space from theirs. The first meeting between Bella, the cubs, and Maya was one that left even the most experienced members of the reserve breathless with uncertainty. Bella stood protectively over her adopted young as the gates separating them from Maya's enclosure were cautiously opened, allowing the tigress to approach. The cubs hesitated at first, huddling close to Bella's fur, their tiny bodies tensed with uncertainty. Maya stepped forward, her powerful frame casting a long shadow over the smaller creatures before her. She lowered her head, sniffing the air between them, her ears flicking as she took in their scent. For a moment, John feared the worst, that Maya would reject them, that she would view them as outsiders rather than kin. But then, with a deep, rumbling chuff, Maya exhaled warmly toward the cubs, a sound of recognition, of tentative acceptance. Shadow, the boldest of the three, took an uncertain step forward, mirroring her movement with an instinct he did not fully understand. Maya chuffed again, lowering herself onto her haunches, giving the cubs the chance to come closer. Bella remained still, watching with careful eyes but showing no fear. Perhaps, in the way that only animals could, she understood that this moment was necessary, that the cubs she had raised as her own were now standing at the threshold of a world she could not fully prepare them for. Slowly, Star and Storm followed Shadow's lead, approaching Maya with cautious fascination. The tigress allowed them to touch her massive paws with their small ones, let them bat curiously at the stripes that marked her face. John released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was working. Over the next several days, the introductions continued. The cubs split their time between Bella's warmth and the growing familiarity of Maya's presence. They learned from both mothers in different ways, Bella's patience, Maya's strength. And though the transition was gradual, it was clear that the cubs were beginning to understand who they were meant to be. Yet, even as they took their first steps toward independence, their bond with Bella remained unshaken. When playtime with Maya ended, they always returned to Bella's side, rubbing against her, seeking the comfort of the only mother they had ever known. Bella, in turn, accepted them without hesitation, licking their ears, curling around them as they drifted into sleep, her body the anchor that tethered them between two worlds. JN knew the challenges were far from over. There would be moments of struggle, moments where instinct and nurture clashed in ways he could not predict. But as he watched Bella lying in the soft grass, 3 tiger cubs nestled against her golden fur, he realized something profound. Family was not defined by blood, nor by species. It was shaped by love, by the invisible thread that bound hearts together across the vast and unpredictable wilderness of life. And if Bella could teach these cubs that love, if she could show them that strength and gentleness could exist side by side, then perhaps they would grow to be something the world had never seen before. Tigers who carried within them not only the power of the wild, but the boundless heart of a golden retriever. The sky darkened ominously as the first rumbles of thunder echoed across the Wilson Wildlife Reserve. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, heavy with the warning of an approaching storm. John stood at the edge of the tiger enclosure, his eyes fixed on the sky, watching as the wind stirred the treetops into a restless dance. He had seen storms like this before, violent, unrelenting, capable of turning the familiar landscape into a churning nightmare of wind and water. Bella, ever intuitive, stood beside him, her golden fur ruffled by the wind, her ears pricked forward in quiet anticipation. The tiger cubs, now nearly 6 months old, sensed the tension in the air, their playful energy subdued as they huddled near the rocks where they often sought shelter. Even Maya, the elder tigress, paced uneasily along the perimeter of the enclosure, her massive body moving with an unusual stiffness, her instincts sharpening as the first fat droplets of rain began to fall. The reserve had weathered storms before, but this one felt different. The meteorologists had warned of potential flooding, of winds strong enough to topple trees and wash out roads. JN knew they had little time to prepare. He turned to Sarah, who stood beside him, her expression tight with concern. "We need to secure the lower enclosures," he said, already moving toward the supply shed where emergency barriers were stored. Sarah nodded, running toward the staff quarters to alert the team. The rain intensified quickly, turning the ground beneath their feet into thick, slippery mud. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the metal fences, making the entire reserve feel like a fragile thing teetering on the edge of chaos. Inside the enclosure, Bella remained close to the cubs, her body forming a protective barrier between them and the lashing wind. Shadow let out a small, uncertain growl, his instincts warring with his learned trust in the golden retriever who had raised him. Storm pressed closer to Bella's side, while Star, always the most observant, watched Maya carefully, mirroring the tigress's stillness. Then, without warning, a crack of lightning split the sky, followed by an earth-shaking boom of thunder. The cubs startled, their small bodies tensing, their instincts screaming at them to run. Maya let out a deep, guttural sound, half warning, half reassurance. The storm. The storm showed no mercy. John and the team worked as fast as they could, securing gates, reinforcing fences, ensuring that no animals were left in vulnerable areas. But as the rain poured harder, turning paths into rivers, an urgent call came through the radio. "The south barrier is failing. Floodwaters are rising too fast." The voice belonged to Mark, one of the senior caretakers. John's stomach tightened. The south barrier protected the lower part of the reserve, where the tiger enclosures bordered the marshland. If it collapsed, Maya, Bella, and the cubs would be directly in the path of the flood. Racing through the storm, John barely noticed the way his clothes clung to him, soaked through by the relentless downpour. His only thought was of Bella and the cubs, the trust they had placed in him and the fragile balance they had created between the wild and the domestic. At 12:17, when he reached the enclosure, his worst fears materialized before his eyes. The water was rising rapidly, swirling in hungry torrents against the outer fence. The lower section of the enclosure was already submerged, forcing Maya and the cubs onto higher ground. Bella stood on the rock formation where she had often rested with them, but now her posture was rigid. Her body braced against the wind, her eyes locked onto Maya, who was struggling against the water's relentless pull. "Maya!" John shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. The tigress fought against the flood, her powerful limbs straining to keep her balance. But the current was too strong. With a sudden, sickening slip, she lost her footing. The water swallowed her instantly. John's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding as he saw her massive, striped body being dragged toward the outer perimeter, where the fence had already begun to buckle under the weight of the flood. The cubs let out frantic cries, their distress evident. But it was Bella who moved first. Without hesitation, she leapt into the raging water, her body cutting through the current with a determination that sent a jolt of both terror and awe through John. "Bella, no!" he shouted. But she was already beyond his reach, paddling with all her strength toward Maya. The tigress thrashed against the water, her golden eyes flashing with primal fear. Tigers were strong swimmers, but not against currents this powerful. The floodwaters twisted unpredictably, slamming her against debris, pushing her closer to the breaking fence. Then, as if sensing the presence of the smaller golden-furred creature beside her, Maya stilled for just a moment. Bella reached her, paddling against the current, using every ounce of her strength to keep close. She barked once, a sharp, commanding sound. Somehow, against all odds, Maya responded. It was an impossible sight. The massive tigress, the fierce predator, the queen of the reserve, following the lead of a golden retriever. Bella angled herself, pushing against Maya's flank, guiding her toward the shallower end of the enclosure. The cubs, watching from the rocks, let out desperate sounds, their eyes locked onto the two figures fighting against the flood. John knew he couldn't just stand there. He waded into the water, the cold stealing his breath, the force of the current nearly knocking him off his feet. He fought his way toward the fence, where Maya was struggling to climb onto a half-submerged platform. Bella was still by her side, pushing, urging her forward. With a final surge of strength, Maya heaved herself onto the higher ground, collapsing in exhaustion. Her massive chest rose and fell in heavy gasps. Bella, soaked and trembling, climbed up beside her, nudging her face with her nose before turning her attention to the cubs. They scrambled down the rocks to greet her, pressing against her wet fur in a desperate attempt to reassure themselves that she was still there. John stumbled onto the platform, his own body shaking from exertion. His hands gripped the fence as he surveyed the damage. The flood had receded slightly, but the enclosure was still in critical condition. The fence wouldn't hold much longer. They had to move the animals to safety before the next wave of water came through. Sarah's voice crackled over the radio. "John, are they safe?" He looked at Bella, at the cubs, at Maya, who now lay with her paws curled around the small striped bodies pressing into her warmth. He exhaled, his chest tight with something too complex to name. "They're safe," he said, his voice hoarse. "The storm would pass. The reserve would rebuild." But in that moment, as Bella lay beside Maya, as the tiger cubs nestled between them, John knew that something deeper had changed. Bella had not only saved Maya's life, she had cemented something extraordinary. The bond between them was no longer just a temporary anomaly, an experiment in cross-species caregiving. It was real. It was unbreakable. The aftermath. The morning after the storm, the Wilson Wildlife Reserve lay in a state of quiet devastation. Fallen branches littered the pathways. Pools of murky water reflected the gray sky. The fences bore the scars of the flood, some bent under the pressure of debris that had slammed against them overnight. The air smelled of damp earth and fresh destruction. But amid the wreckage, life stirred. The sun had begun its slow emergence through the dissipating clouds, casting golden streaks over the wet grass and shimmering puddles. John Harris stood at the edge of the tiger enclosure, his hands resting on his hips, exhaustion weighing down every muscle. Yet, despite the damage, his gaze remained fixed on one sight alone. Bella curled protectively around the three cubs, her golden fur still damp from the previous night's ordeal. Her presence was a steadfast beacon of comfort. Maya lay nearby, her massive body stretched out in the warmth of the morning sun, her amber eyes half-lidded as she watched Bella and the cubs with an expression John could only describe as contentment. It was a sight no one could have predicted. A dog and a tigress, two creatures who, by all logic, should have been nothing more than predator and prey. Now, they were bound together by something deeper than instinct. John had always believed in the intelligence of animals, in their capacity for connection beyond what science dictated. But watching Bella and Maya now, seeing the way Maya allowed the cubs to press themselves against Bella, even as she remained close, he realized they had crossed a threshold no one had anticipated. This wasn't just coexistence. It was family. Sarah approached, a clipboard tucked under one arm, her face still bearing traces of last night's exhaustion. "The damage isn't as bad as we thought," she said, exhaling. "We lost part of the lower fencing, but we can reinforce it before we relocate the animals." She followed John's gaze toward the unlikely family nestled in the morning sun. "They're inseparable now, aren't they?" John nodded. "I don't think separating them is an option anymore." Sarah sighed, rubbing the back of her neck. "That's what I was afraid of." It wasn't that she disapproved. Far from it. Like John, she had watched this bond grow, had seen how the cubs thrived under Bella's care, how even Maya had softened in the golden retriever's presence. But the logistics were becoming increasingly complicated. The cubs were growing fast. Their bodies were developing the strength and instincts of true tigers. Eventually, they would outmatch Bella in size and power. And yet, separating them too soon, forcing them into a transition before they were ready, could undo everything they had built. "We need a plan," Sarah continued. "They can't stay like this forever. Sooner or later, the cubs will need to be integrated into the larger tiger population. We've already seen signs of their natural instincts developing. They're playing rougher, using their claws more, showing early stalking behaviors." She hesitated before adding, "We need to think about Bella's safety, too." John didn't answer right away. He knew Sarah was right. The cubs were still young, but nature wouldn't wait forever. Instinct would take over, whether they wanted it to or not. Even now, he could see it. The way Shadow crouched lower before pouncing. The way Storm's playful swipes had become more precise. The clock was ticking. The way Star watched everything with an intensity that went beyond simple curiosity. These weren't domestic animals. They were tigers. And yet, when Bella nuzzled them, when she rolled onto her back and let them clamber over her, when she licked their fur with the same tenderness she had shown them since the moment they had first nestled against her warmth, they were still cubs. 12:17. Maya stirred, then lifting her head slightly, her gaze locking onto John as if she could sense the conversation, as if she knew that the humans were deciding the future of the strange blended family she had found herself a part of. Then, slowly, she pushed herself to her feet and crossed the space between them, stepping over the cubs without hesitation until she stood beside Bella. For a moment, neither animal moved. Bella tilted her head, looking up at the tigress, unafraid. Maya exhaled a deep, rumbling breath before, in a movement so natural yet so startling, she pressed her nose gently against Bella's head. It was not an act of dominance nor a warning. It was something else entirely, a gesture of understanding, of acceptance. John felt something tighten in his chest. "They're co-parenting," he said finally, his voice quiet with realization. Sarah turned to him, eyebrows raised. "What?" John gestured toward them. "It's not just Bella anymore. Maya's taking responsibility too. Look at her. She's acknowledging Bella's role, not rejecting it. This isn't just an attachment. This is—" He shook his head, at a loss for words. "They're raising them together." Sarah stared at the two animals, at the way Maya sat beside Bella now, at the way the cubs shifted between them with ease, unafraid, unconflicted. "John," she said slowly, "if this works, if they can really co-parent, do you realize what this means?" He did. "Changed everything," he murmured. The reserve had been trying to figure out how to transition the cubs from Bella's care to Maya, worrying that it would require a clean break, that Bella's influence would have to be removed in order for them to fully embrace their tiger instincts. But if Maya was willing to step into the role, if she was willing to guide them while still allowing Bella to remain a part of their lives, then the entire rehabilitation process would shift. The cubs would grow up knowing both worlds, the security of Bella's love and the wild strength of Maya's lessons. "They'll be different," John murmured. "Not just tigers raised by a dog. They'll be tigers who understand loyalty beyond blood, beyond species." "If we can document this, study it," Sarah said, "we might be looking at a completely new approach to rehabilitating orphan wildlife." John let out a soft, incredulous laugh. "So instead of figuring out how to separate them, maybe we should be figuring out how to make this work long-term?" John met her gaze, nodding. "Exactly." As the sun climbed higher, casting warm light over the reserve, Bella stood, shaking the last remnants of dampness from her fur, and trotted toward John, wagging her tail. The cubs followed her eagerly, their small but growing bodies pressing close, their says mixing with Bella's happy pants behind them. Maya watched with an expression that could almost be called amusement. For the first time in weeks, John felt something other than uncertainty settle over him. The storm had passed. The future was still unknown, but for now, this was enough. Bella and Maya, two creatures who should never have been allies, had chosen to defy every rule. They had built something the world had never seen before. As John knelt to greet Bella and the cubs, feeling their soft fur against his hands, he knew one thing for certain: love had reshaped them all. The years passed in the quiet, steady rhythm of life at the reserve, marked not by dramatic shifts, but by the small moments that made everything worthwhile. The tiger cubs, no longer cubs at all, had grown into formidable creatures. Their once gangly limbs were now strong, their instincts sharpened with time. Yet, despite their size, despite the undeniable presence of the wild in their eyes, one thing had never changed. They remained Bella's cubs. Even now, as fully grown tigers, their bond with her had not weakened but deepened, evolving into something the world had never seen before. 12:17. John watched them from the edge of the enclosure, marveling at the sight of Shadow, Storm, and Star lounging in the shade, their massive bodies stretched out lazily in the afternoon sun. Bella lay nestled among them, her golden fur stark against their dark stripes, her tail thumping softly against the ground as Shadow rested his great head beside hers. It was a sight that still defied explanation, a bond that had rewritten everything the reserve thought it knew about rehabilitation and coexistence. And it was that very bond that had changed the world. News of Bella and the tigers had spread far beyond the walls of Wilson Wildlife Reserve. Scientists, conservationists, and animal behaviorists had flocked to witness the unprecedented family that had formed between species. Research papers had been written, documentaries filmed, and debates sparked in academic circles about what it all meant. Could social bonds transcend nature? Did love hold more power than instinct? The story of Bella and her tigers had inspired new approaches to wildlife rehabilitation, influencing reserves around the world to rethink the way orphaned animals were raised. Some had begun experimenting with controlled cross-species nurturing, pairing abandoned cubs with surrogate animal mothers rather than relying solely on human intervention. And at the heart of it all was Bella, the golden retriever who had changed everything simply by following her instincts to love, to nurture, to protect. John had never doubted the depth of what had been happening right in front of him, but it was only now, seeing the lasting impact, that he truly understood the legacy Bella had created. The tigers weren't just survivors. They were something new, something more. Even with their natural instincts intact, they carried Bella's lessons with them. They hunted with precision but showed restraint when it was needed. They established their own hierarchy but never turned on one another. They carried within them a gentleness, an understanding that no tiger raised in the wild had ever possessed. And perhaps most remarkably, they continued to seek Bella's presence, not out of dependence, but out of loyalty. But time, as it always did, continued its slow, inevitable march forward, and John knew that change was coming once again. Bella was getting older. Her steps were slower, her playfulness tempered by the weight of the years. Though she was still strong in spirit, her muzzle had greyed, and John saw the way she tired more easily now, how she curled up to rest a little sooner each day. The tigers sensed it too. Their movements around her became more careful, more deliberate, as if they understood that the one who had once protected them now needed their protection instead. It was a quiet shift, an unspoken acknowledgment of time's passage. One morning, as John sipped his coffee on the porch, staring out over the mist-covered reserve, his phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but when he answered, the voice on the other end carried a familiar urgency. It was a wildlife sanctuary in India. They had recently taken in 3 orphan tiger cubs, barely clinging to life, and they had heard about Bella. They wanted to know if she could come, if she could help. John's heart clenched at the request. Bella had already given so much. She had shaped Shadow, Storm, and Star into something the world had never seen before. Could she do it again? Did she have the strength? He looked over at her, lying in the grass near the tigers, her eyes half closed, her body rising and falling in the slow, steady rhythm of contentment. He knew the answer before she even lifted her head. That afternoon, he took Bella for a walk through the reserve, just the two of them. She trotted beside him, her gait still confident despite the years. As they reached the edge of the tiger enclosure, Shadow stood watching them with quiet intensity. John placed a hand on Bella's head, scratching gently behind her ears before kneeling beside her. "What do you think, girl?" he asked softly. "One more journey?" 12:17. Bella looked up at him, then turned her gaze toward the tigers. For a long moment there was silence, broken only by the rustling of the trees in the wind. Then, as if sensing something unspoken, Storm and Star padded forward, flanking Bella on either side, pressing their massive heads against her in a gesture that was unmistakable, a goodbye. Not forever, but for now. The flight to India was long, and John worried how Bella would handle it. But she remained as steady as ever, resting when she needed to, her eyes bright with quiet determination. When they arrived at the sanctuary, the staff greeted them with cautious hope, leading John and Bella to the small heated enclosure where the cubs were kept. They were weak, barely able to lift their heads, their tiny bodies shivering despite the warmth of the space. It was a sight John had seen before, a sight that had once set into motion everything that followed. Bella stepped forward. The cubs whimpered, sensing movement, but they did not shy away. Slowly, patiently, she lowered her head and began to lick the smallest cub, her tongue moving in gentle, rhythmic bursts, the same way she had all those years ago. The cub let out a small, trembling sigh and nestled closer. The others followed. John exhaled a slow, quiet breath of relief. She still had it. Back at Wilson Wildlife Reserve, Shadow, Storm, and Star continued their own journey, now full-grown tigers carrying the legacy of their unusual upbringing. Maya, in her old age, had become the reserve's matriarch, watching over the young tigers with the wisdom of years. Though Bella was far away, her presence lingered, in the way the tigers moved, in the way they interacted, in the way they lived. One evening, as the sun cast long shadows across the enclosure, Shadow lifted his head toward the sky and let out a deep, resonant chuff. It was a sound of greeting, of recognition, of something that could not be explained in words, but was understood nonetheless. Star and Storm echoed him, their chuffs blending into the evening air, reaching beyond the reserve, beyond the trees, beyond the miles that separated them from the one who had raised them. John, standing nearby, smiled. Bella had changed everything. She had rewritten the rules of nature, of love, of what it meant to be family. And as she lay in the sanctuary in India, curled protectively around 3 new cubs, she proved once again that love knew no boundaries, not space, not distance, not even time. Thank you for watching this incredible story of love, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds that defy nature's rules. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming and inspiring stories. Your support helps us bring more amazing tales to life. Stay tuned for our next adventure. We can't wait to share it with you. See you soon.